What happened when scientists gave mice everything they needed? Imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering that you never have to worry about survival again. There is food. Always. Water. Always. A warm place to sleep. A safe place to live. No predators. No winter. No hunger. No war. No bills. No competition for the things you need. Everything has already been taken care of. At first, it sounds like paradise. But then imagine something else. Imagine watching that paradise slowly fall apart. Not because the food disappeared. Not because a disease swept through the population. Not because an enemy attacked. But because the creatures living inside it began to change. This wasn't science fiction. In the late 20th century, an American researcher named John B Calhoun created a series of controlled environments for rodents. And one of the most famous became known as Universe 25. A world designed to give mice almost everything they needed. Except one thing. Space. And what happened next became one of the most disturbing stories in the history of behavioral science. Because the mice didn't simply become overcrowded. Their entire social world began to unravel. But here's where the story gets complicated. Because Universe 25 does not prove that humans will destroy themselves when life becomes too comfortable. It doesn't prove that cities inevitably collapse. And it doesn't prove that humanity is destined to become a colony of dysfunctional mice. The real story is much more interesting. Because Calhoun wasn't simply asking what happens when there are too many animals. He was asking something much deeper. What happens to behavior when a society can no longer function normally? And that question may be more relevant than the experiment itself. The perfect world. You might think the biggest problem in a mouse society would be hunger. It wasn't. Calhoun's experimental environments were designed to provide abundant food and water. The mice were protected from predators. They had nesting materials. They had shelter. They had places to live. In Universe 25, the basic necessities of survival were deliberately removed as problems. The mice didn't have to spend their lives searching for food. They didn't have to escape predators. They didn't have to survive freezing winters. They were given a kind of artificial abundance. And at first, the experiment looked like a success. The mice began reproducing. Their numbers increased. The population expanded. More and more animals occupied the artificial world. Everything appeared to be working exactly as planned. And this is where the story becomes fascinating. Because if you looked at the colony during its early growth, you might have thought Calhoun had created paradise. But paradise had a hidden problem. The environment had limits. The food could be replenished. The water could be replenished. The nesting materials could be replenished. But something else couldn't. Social space. When more became too much. Think about the difference between a room and a home. A room is physical space. A home is something more. It's territory, privacy, familiarity, a place where you know where you belong. For animals that live socially, these boundaries can matter enormously. Who gets to occupy a particular area? Who has access to a mate? Who protects the young? Who retreats when threatened? Who dominates? Who submits? Who belongs? These aren't just abstract questions. They're part of the social structure of many animals. And as the population of Universe 25 grew, those structures began to become increasingly disrupted. More mice. More interactions. More competition. More unwanted contact. More social pressure. Eventually, the animals began displaying abnormal behaviors. Aggression increased in some parts of the colony. Parenting behavior became disrupted. Some animals became withdrawn. Others became excessively aggressive. And Calhoun began using a phrase that would later become famous. The behavioral sink. The behavioral sink. The term sounds almost like something from a horror movie. A behavioral sink. But Calhoun was describing something very specific. A situation where abnormal social behaviors appeared to feed into further social disruption. One behavior could make another behavior more likely. And that could create another problem. and another, until the normal structure of the colony began breaking down. It wasn't simply too many mice. It was too many disrupted interactions. And that distinction matters. Because the mice still had food. They still had water. They still had shelter. The basic resources of survival were still available. Yet something was happening at the level of social organization. The colony was becoming increasingly dysfunctional. And then, something even stranger appeared. The beautiful ones. Imagine walking through the enclosure. You see mice everywhere. Thousands of them have lived here. The population once exploded. But now, some of the remaining animals behave differently. They aren't fighting for territory. They aren't aggressively competing for mates. They aren't raising families. Instead, they spend much of their time alone, grooming themselves, eating, sleeping, repeating the same behaviors. They look physically healthy. Almost perfect. Calhoun called them the beautiful ones. The name came from their appearance. Because they weren't visibly damaged. They were well groomed. They weren't covered in wounds from fighting. They appeared physically fine. But socially, something was missing. They were largely disengaged from the reproductive and social behaviors necessary for the colony to continue. And that created one of the most haunting images associated with Universe 25. Animals that looked healthy. Inside a society that was dying. Think about that for a moment. The population wasn't disappearing because every mouse was physically sick. It was disappearing because the behaviors required to sustain the population were breaking down. And that raised a disturbing question. Could a society fail without its individual members necessarily dying first? The collapse. Eventually, reproduction declined. The population stopped growing. Then it began falling. The colony entered a phase where the future generation was no longer being produced normally. And once that happened, recovery became increasingly difficult. Older animals aged. New animals weren't replacing them. And the behaviors needed for reproduction had become severely disrupted. The population continued downward. Until eventually, Universe 25 became almost empty. The world that had once been filled with thousands of mice was reduced to a small number of survivors. The experiment became famous because of the apparent contradiction. They had food. They had water. They had shelter. They had protection. They had everything they needed to survive. And yet, the society collapsed. But here is where we need to stop. Because this is the moment when the internet version of Universe 25 usually goes too far. It says, give humans everything they need. And eventually humanity will collapse just like the mice. But that's not what the experiment proved. The part people forget. Mice are not humans. Universe 25 was an artificial environment. The animals couldn't simply leave. They couldn't build another city. They couldn't invent new institutions. They couldn't change the rules of the experiment. They couldn't create new cultural systems. They couldn't decide to redesign their environment. And that matters enormously. Calhoun himself created the environment. He controlled it. He created the boundaries. He determined where resources were available. And the social dynamics that emerged occurred inside that artificial world. As later historians and scientists have pointed out, the dramatic effects Calhoun produced in his experimental universes weren't simply observations of what happens naturally in the wild. He had created a very particular environment. So Universe 25 isn't a crystal ball showing humanity's future. It's not evidence that comfortable societies inevitably collapse. It's not proof that population density automatically causes social destruction. The real lesson is much narrower. And much more interesting. Environment can shape behavior. Why did the experiment matter? Calhoun's work became famous during an era when people were deeply worried about population growth. In the 1960s and 1970s, fears about overpopulation were widespread. And his rodents seemed to offer a terrifying visual metaphor. More animals. More crowding. More social disruption. Eventually, collapse. His research became part of a much larger cultural conversation about cities, population growth, social disorder, and the future of civilization. But scientists studying human societies found something much more complicated. Human beings don't respond to density in one universal way. Crowding can create stress. But humans can also adapt. We create rules. We create architecture. We create transportation systems. We create neighborhoods. We create private spaces. We create institutions. And perhaps most importantly, we create meaning. That's something the mice couldn't do. So why does Universe 25 still haunt us? Maybe because the experiment touches something deeper than population. Something human. Something we recognize immediately. The fear that you can have everything and still feel that something is missing. Think about modern life. You can have food delivered to your door. You can communicate with someone thousands of kilometers away in seconds. You can watch almost any movie ever made. You can listen to almost any song ever recorded. You can work from home, shop from home, socialize from home, and sometimes you can spend an entire day surrounded by information without having a meaningful conversation with another person. We have solved problems our ancestors couldn't even imagine. But we haven't solved every human problem. Because survival isn't the only thing humans need. We also need relationships, belonging, purpose, identity, meaning, and a sense that our actions matter. Universe 25 doesn't prove that comfort destroys those things. But it gives us a strange thought experiment. What happens when a system becomes extremely good at satisfying physical needs, while leaving social and psychological needs unresolved? The real lesson. Maybe the most interesting part of Universe 25 isn't the collapse. It's the assumption that came before it. The assumption that if you provide enough food, enough water, enough safety, you have solved the problem of life. But humans have never lived by survival alone. We tell stories. We form families. We build religions. We create art. We compete. We cooperate. We search for status. We fall in love. We raise children. We create things that may outlive us. We need more than an environment that keeps our bodies alive. We need an environment in which our behaviors make sense. And perhaps that's what makes the beautiful ones so haunting. They weren't necessarily starving. They weren't necessarily physically broken. They simply stopped participating in the social world around them. And when enough individuals stop performing the behaviors that keep a society functioning, the society itself can begin to disappear. Not with an explosion. Not with a war. Not with a single catastrophic event. But quietly. One behavior at a time. The final question. So, what actually happened when scientists gave mice everything they needed? They discovered something unexpected. Giving an animal everything required for physical survival doesn't automatically guarantee a healthy social world. But they did not discover a simple formula for human collapse. They didn't prove that paradise is impossible. And they didn't prove that humans need suffering in order to survive. What they discovered was something more subtle. A society isn't just a collection of bodies sharing resources. It's a network of relationships, roles, boundaries, behaviors, and connections. Break enough of those, and abundance alone may not save the system. So perhaps the question Universe 25 leaves us with isn't, what happens when we have everything? It's something more uncomfortable. What happens when we have everything we need to survive, but lose the things that make survival meaningful? Because a cage can provide food. A shelter can provide warmth. A machine can provide convenience. But none of those things can answer the oldest human question. Why should I get up tomorrow? Maybe that's the real mystery of Universe 25. Not that the mice were given too much, but that survival was never the whole story. And perhaps neither is ours.